Good morning, boys and girls, and welcome to another episode of Pep's Corner. Today we will continue our book, Walk to Moons. Our focus is posted on the screen. We will be reading from chapters 40 and 41, which can be found on pages 238 through 249. We are in week 6, day 1. So go ahead, go grab your book. Make sure you are actively participating and actively following along in the reading. Remember, boys and girls, to reread a second time. It helps to deepen the understanding, and you are coming to shared reading prepared for discussion. Let's begin. Chapter 40, The Gifts. It seemed fitting that at this point in my story of Phoebe, Gramps called out, "Idaho!" We were high in the mountains and had just crossed the Montana border into Idaho. For the first time, I believed we were going to make it to Lewiston by the next day. The 20th of August, my mother's birthday. Gramps suggested we press on to Coeur d'Alene, about an hour away, where we could spend the night. From there, Lewiston was about 100 miles due south, an easy morning's journey. How does that sound to you, Gooseberry? Gram was still, her head pressed against the back of the seat and her hands folded in her lap. Gooseberry? When Gram spoke, you could hear the rattle in her voice, in her chest. Oh, that's fine, she said. Gooseberry, are you feeling okay? I'm a little tired, she said. We'll get you in bed real soon. Gramps glanced at me, back at me, troubled. Gram, if you want to stop now, that would be okay, I said. Oh, no, she said. I'd like to sleep in Coeur d'Alene tonight. Your mama sent us a postcard from Coeur d'Alene, and on it was a beautiful, bountiful blue lake. She coughed, a long, rattly cough. Gramps said, okay then. Bountiful blue lake, here we come. Gramps said, I'm so glad Petey's mama came home. I wish your mama could come home too. Gramps nodded his head for about 5 minutes. Then he handed me a tissue and said, tell us about Mrs. Partridge. What was she doing leaving a gold-dang envelope on Peebee's porch? That's what Peebee and I wanted to know. Did you want something, Mrs. Partridge? I asked. She put her hand on to her lips. She said. Phoebe snatched the envelope and ripped it open. She read the message aloud. Don't judge a man until you've walked 2 moons in his moccasins. Mrs. Partridge turned to go. Bye-bye, she said. Mrs. Partridge, Phoebe called. We've already had this one. I beg your pardon, Mrs. Partridge says. It was you, wasn't it? Phoebe said. You've been creeping around leaving these messages, these things, haven't you? Did you like them? Mrs. Partridge said. As she stood there in the middle of the sidewalk with her head tilted up at us and that quizzical look on her face, she looked like a mischievous child. Margaret reads them to me from the paper each day, and when there's a nice one, I ask her to copy it down. I'm sorry I gave you that one about the moccasins already. My noggin forgot. But why did you bring them here? Phoebe said. I thought they would be a grandful of surprises for you. Like fortune cookies, only I didn't have any cookies to put them in. Did you like them anyway? Phoebe looked at me for a long time. Then she went down the steps and said, Mrs. Partridge, when was it that you met my brother? You said you didn't have a brother, Mrs. Partridge said. I know, but you said you met him. When was that? She tapped her head. Noggin, remember? Let's see. Some time ago, a week, 2 weeks? He came to my house by mistake. He let me feel his face. That's why I thought he was your brother. He has a similar face. Isn't it pickable? Phoebe said, no more pickable than most things lately. As Mrs. Partridge tottered back to her house, Phoebe said, it's a pickable world, Sal. She walked across the grass and spit into the street. She said, come on, try it. I spit into the street. What do you think? Phoebe said. We spit again. It might sound disgusting, but to tell you the truth, we got a great deal of pleasure from those spits. I doubt if I ever could explain why that was, but for some reason, it seemed the perfect thing to do. And when Phoebe turned around and went into the house, I knew that was the right thing for her to do too. With the courage of that spit for me, I went to see Margaret Cadaver, and we had a long talk. And that's when I found out how she met my father. It was painful to talk with her, and I even cried in front of her. But afterward, I understood why my father liked to be with her. Ben was sitting on my front steps when I got home. He said, "I bought you something. It's out back." He led me around the side of the house, and there, strutting across that little patch of grass, was a chicken. I was never in my life so happy to see a chicken. Ben said, "I named it, but you can change the name if you want." When I asked him what its name was, he leaned forward, and I leaned forward, and another kiss happened. A spectacular kiss, a perfect kiss. And Ben said, "Its name is Blackberry." "Oh," Graham said, "is that the end of the PB story?" "Yes," I said. "That wasn't quite true. I suppose as I could have told more. I could have told about Phoebe getting adjusted to having a brother and to her new mother and all of that. But that part was still going on even as we traveled through the mountains. It was a whole different story. I like that story about Phoebe, and I'm glad it wasn't too awfully sad." Graham closed her eyes, and for the next hour, as Gramps drove toward Coeur d'Alene, he and I listened to her rattly breathing. I watched her lying there so still, so calm. "Gramps," I whispered, "she looks a little gray, doesn't she?" "Yes, she does, Chickabiddy. Yes, she does." He stepped on the gas, and we raced toward Coeur d'Alene. Chapter 41, The Overlook. At Coeur d'Alene, we went straight to the hospital. Gramps had tried to wake Graham when he saw the lake. "Gooseberry," Gramps said. She slumped sideways on the seat. "Gooseberry?" The doctor said Graham had had a stroke. Grams insisted on being with her while she underwent tests. Though an intern had tried to dissuade him, "She's unconscious," the intern said. "She won't know whether you're here or not." "Sonny, I've been by her side for 51 years, except for 3 days when she left me for the Eggman. I'm holding on to her hand. See? If you want me to let go, you'll have to chop my hand off." They let him stay with her. While I was waiting in the lobby, a man came in with an old beagle. The receptionist told him he would have to leave the dog outside. "By herself?" the man said. I said, "I'll watch her. I had a dog just like her once." I took the old beagle outside, and when I sat down on the grass, the beagle put her head in my lap and murmured, in that special way dogs have. Gramps calls it a dog's purr. I wondered if Gramps' snake bite had anything to do with her stroke, and if Gramps felt guilty for whizzing off the highway and stopping at that river. If we hadn't gone to that river, Graham would never have been bitten by that snake. And then I started thinking about why my mother's stillborn baby, and maybe if I hadn't climbed that tree, and if my mother hadn't carried me, maybe the baby would have lived, and my mother never would have gone away, and everything would still be as it used to be. But as I sat there thinking these things, it occurred to me that a person couldn't stay all locked up in the house like Phoebe and her mother had tried to do at first. A person had to go out and do things and see things. And I wondered for the first time if this had something to do with Graham and Gramps taking me on this trip. The beagle in my lap was just like our old Moody Blue. I rubbed her head and prayed for Graham. I thought about Moody Blue's litter of puppies. For the first week, Moody Blue wouldn't let anyone come anywhere near those puppies. She licked them clean and nuzzled them. They squealed and pawed their way up to her with their eyes still sealed. Gradually, Moody Blue let us touch the puppies, but she kept her sharp eyes on us, and if we tried to take a puppy out of her sight, she growled. Within a few weeks, the puppies were stumbling away from her, and Moody Blue spent her days herding them back. But when they were about 6 weeks old, Moody Blue started ignoring them. She snapped at them and pushed them away. I told my mother that Moody Blue was being terrible. She hates her puppies. "It's not terrible," my mother said. "It's normal. She's weaning them from her." "Does she have to do that? Why can't they stay with her? It isn't good for her children. It isn't good for her or for them. They have to become independent. What if something happened to Moody Blue? They wouldn't know how to survive without her." While I prayed for Graham outside the hospital, I wondered if my mother's trip to Idaho was like Moody Blue's behavior. Maybe part of it was for my mother and part of it was for me. When the beagle's owner returned, I went back inside. It was after midnight when a nurse had told me I could see Graham. She was lying still and gray on the bed. A little dribble was coming out of the one side of her mouth. Gramps was leaning over her, whispering in her ear. A nurse said, "I don't think she can hear you." "Of course she can hear me," Gramps said. "She'll always be able to hear me." Gramps' eyes were closed. Wires were attached to her chest and to a monitor, and a tube was taped on her hand. I wanted to hold her and wake her up. Gramps said, "We're going to be here a while, Chickabiddy." He reached in his pocket and pulled out his car keys. "Here, in case you need anything from the car." He handed me a crumpled wad of money. "In case you need it." "I don't want to leave, Graham," I said. "Heck," he said, "she doesn't want you sitting around this old hospital. You just whisper in her ear if you want to tell her anything, and then you go and do what you have to do. We're not going anywhere, your grandmother and I. We'll be right here." He winked at me. "You be careful, Chickabiddy." I leaned over and whispered in Graham's ear, and then I left. In the car, I studied the map, leaned back in the seat, and closed my eyes. Gramps knew what I was going to do. The key was cold in my hand. I studied the map again. One curvy road ran direct from Coeur d'Alene to Lewiston. I started the car, backed it up, and drove around the parking lot. Stopped and turned off the engine. I counted the money in my pocket and looked at the map once more. In the course of a lifetime, there are some things that mattered. Although I was terrified when I drove out of the parking lot, once I was on the highway, I felt better. I drove slowly and I knew how to do it. I prayed to every passing tree, and there were a thumping lot of trees along the way. It was a narrow, winding road without traffic. It took me for 4 hours to drive the 100 miles from Coeur d'Alene to the top of Lewiston Hill, which to me was more of a mountain than a hill. I pulled into the overlook at the top. In the valley far below was Lewiston, with the Snake River winding through it. Between me and Lewiston was the treacherous road with its hairpin turns that twisted back and forth down the mountain. I peered over the rail looking for the bus that I knew was still somewhere down there on the side of the mountain, but I couldn't see it. "I can do this," I said to myself over and over. "I can do this." I eased the car back onto the road. At the first curve, my heart started thumping. My palms were sweating and the slippery on the wheel. I crept along with my foot on the brake, but the road doubled back so sharply and plunged so steeply that even with my foot on the brake, the car was going faster than I wanted to. When I came out of that curve, I was in the outside lane, the one nearest to the side of the cliff. It was a sharp drop down with only a thin cable strung between occasional posts to mark the edge of the road. Back and forth across the hill of the road snaked for a half mile. I was on the inside against the hill and felt safer. And then I came to one of those awful curves, and for the next half mile, I was on the outside of the dark slide of the hillside stretched down, down, down. Back and forth I went, a half a mile safe, a curve, a half a mile edging the side of the cliff. Halfway down was another overlook, a thin extra lane marked off less as an opportunity to gaze at the scenery. I thought that to allow drivers a chance to stop and gather their wits. I wondered how many people had abandoned their cars at this point and walked the remaining miles down. As I stood looking over the side, another car pulled into the overlook. A man got out and stood near me, smoking a cigarette. "Where are the others?" he asked. "What others?" "Whoever's with you. Whoever's driving." "Oh," I said, "around." "Taking a pee, huh?" he said, referring. I gathered to whoever was supposedly with me. A hell of a road to be driving at night, isn't it? I do it every night. I woke up in Pullman and lived down there. He pointed to the lights of Lewiston and the Black River. "You've been here before?" he said. "No." "See that?" He pointed to a spot somewhere below. I peered into the darkness. Then I saw the severed treetops and the rough path cut through the brush. At the end of this path, I could see something shiny and metallic reflecting the moonlight. It was the one thing I had been looking for. A bus went off the road there a year or more ago, he said. Skidded right there, coming out of that last turn, and went sliding into this here overlook and on through the railing and rolled over and over into those trees. A hell of a thing. When I came home that night, rescuers were still hacking their way through the brush to get to it. Only one person survived, you know. I knew.